So this is the third session that we have, and so I've been kind of thinking about how we're going to map out the next couple. And today I want to talk specifically about the church as a thing that we do. And we've been talking about our experience and so on, but I want to talk explicitly about how we think about church and how that might be changing as we're going through this time right now. Everybody good with seeing the screen? And we're going to leave people's microphones available, and so I encourage you while we're going through to just speak up. And a couple of places we're going to explicitly stop and talk about stuff, but at any time, please just unmute yourself and ask a question or disagree or whatever it is that you want to do. Somehow that came up as session 13. Not sure why, but it's 3. Okay, so the last time we asked two key questions is what have we learned? What have we learned as we went through the process that all happened in our lifetime of going from being RLDS to becoming Community of Christ? And we talked about how in many ways that could be seen as us turning the corner from a church of modernity into much more of a church that is postmodern in some of the ways that it thinks. The shift from doctrine to principles and so on, we've talked about those before. We had about 5 screens of things that we've learned, and they were all good and valid, but I want to pick out a few of the things that we identified last time when we said, here's what we've learned. One of the things that several people identified was that church is beyond just the bricks and mortar, beyond the building. And in particular, identified that it's beyond just what happens on Sunday mornings. And the idea then that everything is church. We're beginning to understand that the classes that we have, the service projects that we do, the potlucks that we have, all of those activities, whether they happen at the church or not is immaterial, but all of those are part of what we understand as church. And certainly our community involvement includes that. Another thing that was highlighted last time by a couple of different people was this idea of I put the label here, prophetic discernment. How many remember what the church's program was in 1980? Anybody remember?
No.
I think that we were still doing Faith to Grow program, right? And then after that, there was Transformation 2000.
Awesome.
And what did Steve Veazey say as one of the very first things after he was ordained as the president of the church?
No more programs.
No new programs. Okay? Not to say that those were bad. It was simply saying we need to change the way that we think about what we are doing as church. We need to take a breath. We need to pause. Remember, someone pointed out last time about that need for us to have that kind of take a little breath before we begin to go through another stage of transformation. And I think that that's what we were doing as a church. But in the years since, we have not had those kinds of church-wide programs where everybody's kind of doing the same thing. But rather, one of the things that we've learned is that we need to, even at the congregational level, follow those impulses of the Spirit as it works with us and with the congregation. And so we have much more of a feel that things are in process, that we'll figure it out as we go, and that things are different in different places. Our congregations, certainly if they ever were, but certainly today are much less cookie cutter than they might have been 30 or 40 years ago. And we identified that there, in fact, are many paths of where we want to go. We then asked the question, what have we learned specifically from the pandemic and the fact that we suddenly now are not meeting in churches, in fact, are meeting online? Well, one of the things that, of course, people identified is that community happens online. Those of, we had a wonderful kind of moment of sharing here in the few minutes while we were waiting for everyone to gather, just like we would have if we were in the basement of any one of our churches, gathered for a class. We would greet people, we'd say hi, how's it going, what's happening in your world, and so on. And so we have that ability to build community. And in fact, the community can be richer and broader and wider because we're meeting online. Some of you, for instance, may be part of quite small congregations. I mentioned last week that the New Liskeard congregation has been coming and joining with the Ottawa congregation since the pandemic started, since we started doing online stuff, which has been wonderful for us and hopefully for them because they have that wider and broader reach. We've learned that we can be flexible. Very few of us congregations are doing today what we thought we were going to start with back in March. March now seems like eons ago in terms of what we're doing and how we're doing it. And so we kind of got forced, but we learned that we can be quite flexible. And at the same time, people express that, as well as some of the great new things, there's some things we really don't miss that much. We don't miss having to drive. That's going to be especially true if we're still doing some of these online things in the middle of the winter when the weather is nasty out. People mentioned the stress of having to prepare for events on Sunday. And we just think about the time that it takes in order to do certain things. And so we've learned some key things, and those I wanted to highlight those because they kind of take us where I want to go in our discussion this evening. While I was preparing this week, I listened to this podcast, and I don't know if anyone else has had a chance to listen to it. I'm going to actually play about 4, 5, 6 minutes of this interview. If you want to go look it up, it's on projectzionpodcast.org, and it's episode 286. But I'd like to share it now because President Scott Murphy talks about their perspective from the first presidency. And I want you to listen to think about what things kind of resonate with you as he talks. Okay? So let's hope that I did all this right, and let's give it a whirl.
Well, I just mentioned a moment ago about the presidency taking time this summer as part of our discernment journey. And part of the discernment work that the World Church Leadership Council is engaged in. Last week, we had an opportunity to meet with a group of young leaders in the field, and they and again, they were spread out in different places, so this wasn't just in one mission center. And one of the questions that we've been asking is, as the World Church Leadership Council is engaging in the journey, is the question of, God, where is your Spirit leading now as we continue to live more faithfully and deeper into the soul of community of Christ. And so as we gathered with that group of young leaders and invited them to share their reflections and helping us understand what it is about the church that is speaking to them, one young woman shared this quote: "Church does not feel like it is confined anymore within four walls." That statement really captured me. And it wasn't just the words that she spoke, but it was the image and the expression in her face that I saw as we saw each other on Zoom. Church does not feel like it is confined to four walls anymore. That is such a powerful statement. And for me, is one of those moments of spiritual disruption that reminds me that even in the midst of the challenges and the deep yearnings that people are feeling and missing with being together, there is something profound that is happening, that is awakening for younger generations, that there is the ability and the power to truly be the church beyond just the walls of our physical buildings that we have held on to. I found myself going back as I've reflected on that in the words that came to the church in inspired counsel out of section 165 of the Doctrine and Covenants. Additional innovative approaches to coordinating congregational life and supporting groups of disciples and seekers are needed to address mission opportunities in a changing world. Those words are coming alive in a new way in the context of what we're facing in the world. And again, while I don't have a theology that believes that God has created the virus and put this in our midst as a wake-up call, I do believe, as I reflected in my article that I just wrote in the Herald, that we're called during this challenging time to be open to what God invites us to learn through this experience. Yeah. And these words, for me, help us understand that in the changing world that we did not envision when these words came into our midst, but they come alive in a real way now. And again, in the words that this young woman shared, that the church is not confined in four walls, is a powerful witness to what is taking place and the lives that are being blessed. So while we yearn for those hugs and being together in person, I hope we will not lose the awareness of the profound blessings that have occurred over the last few months as we've experienced being a church in a new way, because this will not go away. We hope the virus goes away, but how we're experiencing the church through online communities is not going away. And I'm having more and more conversations with members of the Council of 12 about the need to create online congregations and what that means in terms of our bylaws and our administrative processes. And so the presidency is wrestling with that because we know that these are emerging life-changing opportunities of mission that we cannot just simply say at the end of the pandemic, oh, we're done with this and let's go back to just the way it was. This is a way forward and in new ways of engaging that is changing us, and hopefully as it changes us, it will begin to change the world.
Okay. So I apologize if you were getting some feedback I think it was coming through my microphone there. Joy muted everybody, and so I invite you to unmute now and tell me what resonated, if anything, with what President Murphy said.
One of the things that he said was that resonated with me was what he said at the very end, or near the very end, that the things that we're learning or putting into place right now as part of or as a result of the pandemic, and the lessons we're learning are not going to just be set aside when this is all behind us. And I think, that is very wise. Like we were saying before we even began officially, what will this mean for World Conference? The lessons that we're learning on how to communicate with each other at various times, not just Sunday mornings and not just within four walls, but in other times like evenings and around the world. So, I was pleased to hear him say that, their hope is to not just throw this all out once the pandemic is over, but, continue to make use of the things that we're learning that are proving to be positive.
Right. Good. Thanks for your feedback. Susan?
I agree. I was going to say the same thing, David, that these past almost 5 months, I feel more connected online with the reunions and the colloquy and worship services than I have with my home congregation. That this is how I'm feeling connected, and I certainly hope. I know some congregations will open in September, but I'm hoping others will still stay online.
When I first started going to World Conference, I didn't realize how it was such a worldwide church. And because I've gone to conference numerous times, I know what that feels like. But we can all get a sense of it being such a worldwide church now because we're able to join anywhere that is holding a Zoom meeting.
Yeah. Hey, Pat?
I loved the idea that he said again right at the end about there being emerging online congregations. There's going to be more and more congregations that are going to be totally different from what we've got now, and they will be online. And I think that's quite exciting.
Okay, Uncle Claire?
I think also that we have to keep in mind the people who don't have computers and iPads and that kind of thing, that maybe we'll come to the place where, like the boards of education, and be able to provide the technology and the equipment to some of our remote people so that they can also be part of this. Now, they've got to want to be involved with the technology. I understand that, and they've got to have access to internet. But I'm sure that over a period of time, some of the people who are very hesitant now would in fact learn how to do it and enjoy it, especially the ones who are way off by themselves somewhere and never ever get a chance to go to church.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. For some of us, this is an alternative. For others, it may be the way that they get connected with the church. If I may just share a little tiny anecdote. I remember when Grant McMurray was president, talking to him. So, I mean, this goes back in the 90s, at the very, very, very beginnings of all of this stuff. And he kind of said, they started doing some things from World Conference, but a woman sent him an email and said, my 11-year-old son sat for the whole 2.5 hours of the World Conference communion service, glued to the computer, watching a little 2.5-inch square. That was the technology then. An absolute fascination that there would be that many people and everything else. And you know, and he kind of said that kind of turned something on for him to realize that even as primitive as it was in those days, it was something that allowed us to reach a lot more people. And so, yeah, I think that's a really good point, especially the budget one that says, yeah, we may be wanting to budget to buy a little stack of tablets or iPads or something so that people can share. Lorna?
Yes, the other thing that I wrote down, as well as what's already been said about prior, was not to lose the awareness of the spiritual blessings that we are getting as we experience Christ, experience church in a new way. And I think that's two parts. First of all, to recognize the blessings that we're getting, and then to not lose them, but to make use of them in future.
Daryl?
I was just going to suggest that for myself, coming from a small congregation like many of us do, where our average in the small congregations is less than 20, that it sure is positive to be able to not only have one worship service, but I found on Sunday, I was on 4 different ones on Sunday. And I said to Mary, I don't want to go on anymore tonight. I've had enough for one day. But it was a very positive experience. And from a smaller congregation, it's wonderful. And I've always felt this way, but I've often heard in their smaller congregations, well, we're just a little congregation. But it's so nice to see, and I'm referring to the Sunday one that I typically watch, which is out of Toronto, where you see people globally. And it even awestruck myself of seeing people around the world. With regard to what Scott said, I do kind of feel for the Council of 12 from the perspective of all the changes that may need to be made from an administrative perspective. I've heard of folks moving their membership from one part of another congregation into Toronto congregation. Well, how do you vote? How do you do business that way? So it's got to be a nightmare for them, in a sense, to discover the newness of what's happening.
Yeah. Kathy?
I got into a discussion this week about children's ministry, and we got onto the children that we have right now seem to be very spread out. You might have one child in your congregation. And so parents and grandparents are going, well, how do our kids get the message then? How does that happen? And there are online ministries. There is in the Mid-Atlantic. I was talking to Katie Harmon McLaughlin, and she was saying, well, they're open to kids joining that. We need to learn from what they're doing so that we don't have to reinvent the wheel, and maybe improve it and do some things here so that we can gather our children so that they have something here. They will get to know each other, and then we will also have in-person things, right? I mean, that there's something that we can do here for children.
Yeah, if you go and actually listen to the rest of the podcast, Linda and Scott talk about spec and you know, some of the things that the spec people were doing in order to include youth from all over the place. And again, they make the observation that in fact the online experience of spec is reaching even wider than the physical experience. Not that you want to replace it, but it is a different kind of experience. And yeah, I think Daryl's comment about the administrative headaches and opportunities are massive. You know, what do you do, for instance? You know, I was thinking we've got congregations that are no longer open, such as the Sudbury congregation, and we have friends there. And what would it mean if they decided, for instance, to join the Ottawa congregation every Sunday for worship? Well, that's all fine. But as we begin to unfold this stuff, you begin to say, well, then does their membership come here? What about priesthood calls? What about, what about? And so at one level, these are wonderful problems to have or challenges to have, but we need to recognize that yeah, it's going to change a lot of things if we really go there. So exciting. And I think it's really interesting that it's not just at the grassroots, but everybody in the church, including the First Presidency, is very aware of what's going on, and I get the sense that they're kind of cheerleading because they're seeing this creativity. Again, in the podcast, they talk with some awe about some congregations and mission centers and how creative they're being in what they're doing. So again, I encourage you to go and listen to that podcast. It happened to be one that really fit well with this theme. And then they all said some great comments about the upcoming plans for the World Conference. We talked about the resolution on violence, and that was also very good.
Kathy brought up a good comment, Lou. I just wanted to highlight for a second the fact that she talked about a children's ministry on the web that her congregation has been watching. Part of the opportunities for this online ministry would be, I was not aware of that. We don't have children in our congregation, but at the same time, from a World Church perspective or from a CEM perspective, to disseminate this. We're pretty good in CEM in terms of communication. That's how I heard about the European peace colloquy. But there's things like Kathy just shared there about this children's ministry. Never knew that, but there's probably some congregations that could make use of that. So that's another challenge, but it's another opportunity for us.
Yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to pick up on Daryl and Kathy. This is Dorothy from Guelph, and we do have a lot of children. And I worry about the 4- and 6-year-olds because they're not going to sit in front of a computer. They need action and they need activities. And so I worry if we're going to lose some of our younger kids.
Yeah,
we have to be more creative somehow or other.
Yeah, lots of opportunities and lots of challenges kind of come with those. Any other last comments, Kathy?
We also need to look to the schools who had to do online ministry, if you want to call it that, to kindergartens and grade 1 and grade 2 kids. They had to do that, and they had to become very creative. So we don't have to just look to the church. We have to look to other camps, other schools, other things outside of the church to get ideas.
Yeah. Excellent. Anyone else?
I wonder if we're just rearranging what we've always been doing, and that we're still serving the same people. So it makes our little Port Elgin congregation feel good because now we're connected to the wider community, and it feels stronger. But I'm still questioning, are we inviting? It's still the same people that are getting the same kind of messages, and that has to change. We're still doing the same worship services. We're just using a different platform. We still have the speaker, we still have the invocation, we have all of that. So it's like still just rearranging the parts or putting it on a different platform. But where are we getting any new people, and are we sharing?
Catherine here. On Mary Jane's point of view, when Community Place started, and Barry Group was inviting some of our coffee and conversation people to the online ministry, it was interesting that while we were online, we were very cliquey. We were talking about people we knew and what they were doing. So it's definitely going to mean some ways of changing the way we do our service so that we don't become cliquey and that we can be inviting.
Anne, did you have a comment?
I think inviting, we've not been strong in inviting in the past to our church buildings. Sometimes people would feel uncomfortable coming to the building. I think, to me, opens up a huge place to invite people to some of the services that are on. Also, many of the things that are on the World Church website, the Enduring Principles. We don't have to be handing them a book. They can be looking at resources that are online. The Daily Bread. I got a prayer, a morning prayer from one of my friends. She's an Anglican girl, and she sent me the daily prayer that she gets every day. And I thought, how lovely that, I got that online. I would never have got that otherwise. But other things like priesthood training can be on. And so those who are not even called to the priesthood could be accessing the material that is online. I just think there's a whole world there that is open. And we have a friend that we were bringing to church with us, Steve. And since we've gone online, he watches Beyond the Walls every Sunday and really has enjoyed that. And then we have talks about the people and the ministry and do you know this person and this kind of thing. So it just opens up a huge world that he would never have had exposure to if he was just in the Grand Valley congregation. So that's, to me, what all the online stuff is, that we have no idea the world that it's opening up because we see bits and pieces of it now, but I think it's going to be huge. All of a sudden, the congregation is global. I call it my global congregation because they're in Europe and they're in Australia, all online. And what brought me,
go ahead.
What brought me back to my origins kind of thing, I watched the story about the history of reunions that was on. And they showed movies of Erie Beach in 1946. So I was 6 years old, and the tents and everything, all of that. It was like it just took me back to my origin in the church, and was such a blessing to see all of the things that I had remembered as a young child. So even for members, it's wonderful. I would never have seen that. I would never have, had that experience. So
I think you're hearing the tension between we've got this new toy, but do we know what to do with it yet? Okay, so on one hand, Anne has held up a couple of things. Absolutely right. It is wonderful to look at that history stuff and to suddenly realize that now you could get a whole gang of people from your generation and say, hey, let's go and watch this online together and share our memories and everything. That's a wonderful experience that you might not be able to do in person. And so that's the good stuff. And then on the other hand, Mary Jane is lifting up and saying, but wait a minute, is this what we're about? Which is great, because that's what we want to talk about. Okay, so one last comment here, Kathy.
I'm thinking that that those two perspectives work really well together because of Jesus's when he said about feed my sheep, look after, or feed my lambs, look after my sheep, feed my sheep. You need all of it. If you don't feed the lambs, they're not going to go out to get, to do the other work. So we've got to have all of that in place. And Steve Veazey, I was at something where he said, we gather to scatter. So we need to feed the people and get them excited so they'll go out. I have never talked so much about the church as just recently. I mean, to my friends who have no idea what the church is. I have been talking to them. I may not have been bringing them to something, but I have been talking about it. And that's a change in me. And it's made a big difference in me. I can be who I am.
Okay, so I think this is a wonderful example to say, you know, this is really kind of touching chords with us. This is resonating with us as we think about what it means. Many of you were part of Zach Harmon McLaughlin's session, and I want to just lift up a couple of things that he talked about and how he expressed it. He said, we're called to be a prophetic people, proclaiming the praise of Jesus Christ and creating communities where all will be welcomed and brought into relationship with God and where there will be no poor. Interesting turn of phrase. He goes on in part of that and he says, makes the point that this is not transactional. This is transformational. And I wonder if some of the things that we have been talking about as in the last few minutes is us struggling between the tension of the transaction of church and its potential to be transformational in our lives. Kathy just talked about how it has changed her. This community is being transformational. And so we need to perhaps think about that. But he goes on to say, we do not define the church by physical assets or locations. We begin defining the church by community and the quality and the character of that community. The quality and the character of that community. And so I suggest that's one of the questions that we want to be asking ourselves as we go through this transition into becoming whatever church is going to come out the other side of the pandemic, out the other side of this turn. One of the things that we have heard, and I have heard it, I may have even said it or thought it, is that we have failed because we didn't teach our children the value and the importance of church. And we find it very easy to often think that the reasons why people are not there, the reasons why the pews beside us are social distancing in the extreme, is that people are walking away because they have very little faith. They haven't caught that faithness. They haven't caught that sense of the sacred, and that therefore we have failed because we have not been able to transmit that or to teach that to our children, to our youth. And yet Zach lifts up that in fact the research says that it has very little to do with faith for many, many people. And that in fact, many of the people who have walked away, and again, if you were in the Restoration 3.0, these would be the people that we called the nuns, the people that are kind of finished with church. That many of those who walked away then were very faithful and had a strong spiritual life. So it wasn't that they didn't understand or appreciate or value what was sacred. And so the question is, why? And inevitably, the answer came that they're walking away from institutions that were no longer authentic to their original mission. And I wonder how much of that we need to to accept, or how much of that would be valid in our experience of being church? Have there been places and times when we have just been an institution that was no longer authentic to our original mission? Now, the word mission gets us into a bunch of different places, because mission is not, the expression of mission has not been the same throughout all time. You know, I've had conversations with people about whether we should sell church building. And often you'll hear someone in the congregation will say, yeah, but our parents and our grandparents, you know, they worked so hard to build this. And my question always back to them is to say, if they were here, would they say that they did all that work and they gave their money, so on, for that building? Or did they understand that building as the mission of the church in their time? That's another expression of mission that we have to think about. So is the issue that we're no longer authentic to our original mission, is that a criticism that says that we no longer have a Christ-like mission? Or is it simply that our mission seems to have changed over time? That may not be necessarily a bad thing. So we have to ask ourselves, where do we fit in there? One of the other things that Zach had was a thing that came out, and if you can't see it, if my picture's covering it, you may have to move it. But he had a quote, and I'm going to show you the pieces of it. He said, "Tradition is the living faith of the dead. Traditionalism is the dead faith of the living." And I thought that was a wonderful quote for us to think about. The living faith of the dead versus the dead faith of the living. And this guy goes on to say, and it's the traditionalism that actually gives tradition a bad name. But there's nothing wrong with tradition. It's what we do with it that becomes the issue for us. He goes on to say, for the church to be a living and moving body, we must not get caught in the trap of traditionalism that holds us hostage to rigid ecclesial forms and practices. Have we heard this message before?
Yes.
Where did you hear it?
In section 162.
Right there.
161. That's what I meant to say.
You're going to be righter in a minute. But we've heard that message before, several times over the last 20 years for sure. One here from Grant McMurray that talks about being respectful of tradition, but don't be captive to those formulas and procedures. And then David was right, 162. This was specifically talking about sacraments, but the notion again is be respectful of tradition, but don't be unduly bound by stuff that no longer fit the needs of a worldwide church. And we could also say, don't be unduly the things that no longer fit the needs of a pandemic-bound church. And so we certainly have that as a message, as being held up to say, we need to understand how we interact with our tradition in valid and healthy ways. So I go back to the quote here, makes the point then that many postmoderns are choosing to walk away from traditionalism because the line between tradition and traditionalism has become blurred. Anybody have anything that comes to mind that they would kind of say, yeah, we sometimes blurred between tradition and traditionalism?
Anne?
When I was a child, we had missionaries, and the missionaries would come through, and they would sit at our table, and we'd have them come after and hear their stories of being in the mission field and all of their wonderful stories. But as the years have gone by in the church, we have talked more about mission, personal mission, so much more than we ever did when we had the missionaries. I never felt missional as a child. And yet now our children are taught to be little missionaries. And we talk about being, it's an active, it's a verb. It's something that we are asked to do, not just to listen to the stories, but to, the stories of the missionaries, but become the missionary. So that's just been going through my mind as you've been sharing these words. So,
thanks. Anyone else?
Tradition and traditionalism can overlap. Also, a person who sees a tradition is a person who can move ahead into the future. And I think they're suggesting that traditionalism is a person that maybe looks to the past. What I'm getting at is that over the last 25, 30, 40 years within the church, there have been things happening, and we have moved ahead, and many people were lodged in a traditionalism and chose to hold on to those traditions in their traditionalism, while many in the church moved on with the understanding that this is the thing to do. Our traditions from the past would tell us. And an example of that would be women in the priesthood. Another example would be 1860, when and between 1844, 1844 and 1860, there were people who were clinging to traditions, and there were others who were clinging as traditionalists. So it's an individual interpretation between tradition and traditionalism.
Okay. Any other comments? But it certainly does raise up for us to say, are these things that we need to own? Are there some parts of what we do and maybe still do that if somebody said to you, why do you do that? You wouldn't actually be able to answer the question other than to say, we just always do. And you know, I remember a friend of mine, it doesn't matter what tradition he came from, but I remember one time we were in a car on a couple-hour road trip, and you know, he knew that I was involved in church, and I knew he was. We began to have a conversation. And after a few minutes, he finally, in frustration, he just kind of said, I don't learn that. I don't learn those things. You know, I'm just told what it is and I do them. And so that kind of took the conversation in a different way because I realized that their mode of dealing with the past was very different than the one that I had been taught or that I had grown up with. Okay. So Zach goes on to talk about this thing we call mission. And he points out that often we get that a little confused because somehow that gets associated with the business of the church. And perhaps some of that is simply because we've changed our language over the last couple of decades as we begin to use this mission language that we didn't use when we were growing up. And he goes on to make the point that it is actually the very essence of the church. The reason for the existence of the church is mission. And so I thought we needed to spend just a few minutes to ask ourselves, are the things that we're learning, that we have learned, the things that we're learning about through the pandemic, the things that we see as opportunities, are we in fact evaluating them and understanding them through the lens of true mission? So let's take a look at a couple of things. I had a good chuckle when Zach Mack's session was over. I went and found his videos, and I was looking at the transcription, and it talked quite extensively about ecclesiology. And this, of course, was an automatically generated transcription, and so this was the software's attempt to figure out what this word ecclesiology really meant. But I got a good chuckle, and Zach really liked it. I think he's going to start using this idea of ecclesiology too. He got a good laugh out of that. Ecclesiology is the $47 word that simply means our theology or our understanding of what the church is. So this is just a way for a word that describes how we talk about what the church is. And we actually kind of do that a lot and have done that a lot in our tradition, as you would hope that someone who is part of a church would actually do. So we have several different expressions of Community of Christ, RLDS, ecclesiology. The very roots of becoming Community of Christ, those seeds begin to grow and flourish in the 1960s. Sort of long before many of us kind of were aware that this was happening, that there was something happening at the church level. 1968, the reunion text caused a lot of issues. People refused to use it. It was based on a book by Landon and Smith, 1969, For What Purpose Assembled. It followed the 1968 book, The Body of Christ, by Schneebeck. And when we go back and you read this now, so this is what, a 51-year-old book? Boy, we don't have to change too much of what Landon and Smith were saying to have it be about who we are today. So when we looked at that text at seminary, we're basically looking back and saying, these guys were way ahead of their time. They saw the evolution of the church, or the potential for the evolution of a church, that the church at the time wasn't necessarily ready to hear. In fact, a lot of people were very upset about that 1969 reunion text because it wasn't talking about the one true church. It wasn't talking about the things that made us different. In fact, it was talking about the things that we share in Christian community with other traditions. And many people were not able to hear that. That's a little of the background then of where that came from. The church, they stated that the church has a threefold task: to proclaim, to teach, and to serve. We roll forward quite a ways. And Tony Chvala-Smith, in his book, A Way of Life, expressed it this way: the church is to proclaim, celebrate sacraments, and practice and embody the mission of Jesus Christ. So that's the role of the church. Steve Veazey, in his A Time to Act, which I think was 2017, the church is to be spiritually formed, to be in community, and to engage in compassionate ministry and action. So these are all expressions of our understanding of what the church is to be about, what the church is. And I guess to state the obvious, you'll see that it says nothing about the church is to have this building, the church is to have this organization, the church is to have this whatever. None of that is really is part of our ecclesiology of what the church is about. That simply is that's the tactical implementation details of how we have decided that we could best do these tasks. This is again from Steve Veazey's thing. Zach likes these graphics that you can't read, so I'm going to actually blow it up so we can read it. And the key phrase in Steve's thing was that our chief purpose is to birth, nurture, and multiply communities of disciples and seekers. To stop there, okay? To birth, nurture, and multiply. And I think that call, that's part of our mission, is what Mary was talking about, of saying we're doing nurturing, we're doing lots of things that we're doing, but how do we invite? How do we invite people so that we're multiplying those communities or birthing new communities? We had people say, in response to the pandemic, we may have opportunity to birth some new communities of people who realize that they could be connected together, whether it's youth, whether it's children, whether it's people who care about this or people who care about that. But again, the chief purpose implies that initiative of inviting. So communities of disciples and seekers engage in spiritual formation. Yeah, there's a new expression. We have talked about that in different ways over the years, but in recent years, spiritual formation has become our favorite way of talking about how do we become better disciples? How do we understand better? That's the inward journey, if you will, that is both individual and as a congregation, and compassionate ministry in action, which is the outward expression of that mission. And so other places, you'll hear that terminology that I think it's in the Doctrine and Covenants, in places that it's both an inner journey, it's an inward journey of spiritual formation, and an outward journey of ministry and action. But when we think about it from an ecclesiology point of view, this is the part that I hope jumps out at us. That everything else, the organizational structure, the resources, the funding, all of that stuff has to be about that primary purpose. And so one of the exercises, if you will, that we can do between now and next week is to think about our own congregations and our own individual experience and ask, is everything else about the church that I know supporting that missional purpose of spiritual formation to compassionate ministry in action? And if the links aren't apparent, is it about the way that we talk about it? Or is it because it isn't there? And so I want us to think about that as we come back next week, because that's where we want to have a whole bunch of people sharing and understanding, sharing their understanding of how they see the church doing this kind of mission. If you go back and look at Zach's thing, and again, don't worry about all the text there. The key that he was talking about was awaken, risk, and bless. And he likened that to the mission prayer. And he makes the point in there that it is repetitive, that it doesn't end because it's not linear, but it is circular. And so that's another thing that I would challenge us to think about. How has the church itself awakened, risked, and what are the blessings? And so the example, that was already raised, that John raised, would be the decision, the change in policy to ordain women to priesthood. The church awoke to a possibility, to a challenge, however you want to frame that. It definitely took a risk and paid a price of going ahead and doing that, especially from an administrative point of view, given that they had done surveys that showed there was very little more than 30% acceptance. And yet, we can probably all share testimonies of the blessing that has come to the church. So that's kind of a macro level example. And so I invite you to think about, what are the other places where we have been through these kinds of cycles? To awaken, to take risk, and to be blessed. And I hope it's not a big stretch for everyone to realize that this is probably what we're going through right now, is another cycle of this as we go through the pandemic. It's helped us learn some things, awaken to some possibilities. And now we're going to go through and say, what are the changes that we're willing to make? What are the things that we're willing to risk? What are we willing to give up? What are we willing to embrace? What about at the congregational level, or the mission center, or the campground? How have those organizations been through this cycle? And again, it's very parallel to the mission prayer. Becoming aware, taking a risk, and looking for that blessing. So again, part of the sort of the homework for next week's session. Think about that. And then what about your personal testimony of the times that you have taken those opportunities to go out and risk something, for most of us, the challenging part is the risk part. We just don't like risk. We don't like uncertainty. So again, one of Zach's slides of many words. But one phrase jumped out at me that he quoted out of Landon and Smith that really has got me thinking over the last few weeks. It says the church is not called to be successful. Does anybody read it fast enough, or do you remember what it said next? The church is not called to be successful. It is called to be faithful. The church is not called to be successful. It is called to be faithful. And then the real rub is willing to risk all, even to die. The challenge of any organization, especially that is built on the backs, the sacrifice of so many who have gone before, is to remain faithful to the vision that drove that sacrifice in the first place. And it can be very difficult for us to not become so paralyzed by not wanting to fail, by not wanting to risk what the generations that went before us had done. That we stop following the mission that made them successful in the first place. And this just is really, really jumped out at me and kind of won't let me go. Because we need to ask ourselves, as we think about, from an ecclesiology point of view, as we think about who we are called to be as a church, we need to ask ourselves and come to grips with this question. Are we willing to be faithful enough to the mission of Jesus Christ to risk all, even if it meant that the institution were to die? So I'll look forward to talking about many of those kinds of issues when we talk about our personal experience and our congregational experience when we meet next time. Any reactions to this evolution, if you will, of our ecclesiology, of our understanding of what it means to be a church, that you'd like to share now?
Susan?
What I'm getting hung up on, what I'm getting stuck with, and I watched Zach's lectures, and when he talked about awaken, he said it begins with discernment. And I wrote that down. We have to become aware of what God is inviting us to do and where to go. That's individually and community. And that's where I'm stuck. It's I know I have to read scripture more. I know I have to pray more. I know I have to be with my faith community more. But it's that discernment. And I know there's wonderful video on at seaofchrist.org to go through discernment. But for me, it's not the risk. It's the awaken, the why, to clarify why we're here. That's where I'm stuck. And if there's ever any lectures on that, I would love to join. And his last phrase that I enjoyed was, he said he's tired of playing church. That's what stuck with me.
Okay. Thank you for sharing, Susan. Does anyone else have experience with this concept of discernment and understanding how that can work in their life?
Catherine here. I think one of the concerns is that we don't do it alone. When we brought in leading congregations in mission, we were asked to do a lot of experimenting and changing and learning new spiritual practices. And when you try to bring that into your faith group and they don't have the same vision or mission that you've just been taught for the last 3 years, it's really hard. So I think as we go forward, it's good that we're having these as group conversations and showing that there is a new way of doing things. So with Susan, it's let's stay together and keep discerning together. Don't do it by yourself all the time.
Right. I took Katie's course, the Meads course on transformation, spirituality. And I've talked with her after. And I'm like, I know I would love a mentor, and she was going to send me lists of mentors, but is there something going on right now? Do our evangelists, are there people that will come and help a congregation discern the mission in their context, right? That's what my question is, I guess.
Kathy?
I'd like to speak to what Catherine just said, because I discovered a number of years ago that sometimes I'm sitting at the wrong table. That I'll be sitting there and there'll be the discussion and I'll realize, oh, wait a minute, I have to be at a different table. I have to, and I think that's wonderful that we have different tables that we can sit at like this. And you can choose different tables to sit at to grow. And also, I was doing some reading and something very short. It said, every time a person encounters an obstacle, they must make up their mind whether the obstacle can or cannot be hurdled. Only those who believe it is possible take the next step. For those who don't, they stop there. So that's bringing in the faith a little bit, that you've got to believe that there is a way forward in any situation.
Bruce?
I was just going to say that the church does have some new materials. They're not really new. They're a couple of years old now on discernment. And Katie Harmon McLaughlin has those resources. I have them here as well. But something that David Brock has said on those resources is the first thing we say to ourselves is, I don't know. I don't know. And I don't know where I'm going. I don't know where it's leading me. I don't know. And then discernment becomes a process. You know, it becomes a process of listening and paying attention. And, you know, all of these classes and sessions that we are involved in now, they all begin to speak to us, you know, gently, you know, just a little here, a little there, and you start to kind of connect the dots, and there's all of whatever you read, whatever you see, but it becomes intentional. I want to discern what this is about and where it's leading me. And so it becomes a very intentional journey of everything you hear, everything you see, everything you is a part of that.
Thanks, Ruth. So you know, one of the things that I heard Ruth saying there was that part of the journey, part of the risk, in fact, is, are we becoming awake to the right thing? Are we discerning the right thing? And yeah, that I get that. I hear that, you know, Susan. I appreciate the same kind of thing. I just share my testimony, my personal experience is I almost never have what I would call spiritual insights, if you want to call it that. There's, you know, it's almost always after. And what I have learned, as you fail lots of times, is that if it's not, and I hate to use the word, if it's not easy, and I don't mean that in terms of not being work and not obstacles and everything else, but if it doesn't flow, that for me is where I find that discernment process. When I was doing seminary, my most powerful experience was just sitting here alone in my study one night. I'm doing some reading, and we kind of actually had an optional reading. It was a paper that Tony had written. It was in restoration studies, and it was kind of optional. It wasn't really required. But as I'm reading the paper, I suddenly became aware in a very, very powerful way. It was very emotional. I feel it now. I was just sitting here, and suddenly the tears are running because I realized that I understood this stuff. It was kind of like I'm reading this paper, and he's talking about the stuff that's going around in Corinth, and I kind of, okay, like I know that, and he's talking about these authors and this author, and it's like, oh, we've read all their stuff. Those are all good friends, and he's talking about this Greek word and what it means, and it's like, well yeah, and suddenly later, as I analyzed it, it was kind of like you're trying to learn a new language, and suddenly you realize you just went into a store and talked to somebody without having to think about it. And that has been my personal experience of discernment. Not up front. I had no vision that would ever happen, but rather of suddenly becoming aware that something important was happening there. You know, I just share that as my unique weirdness in how I experience that. Because each of us is going to have our own things that resonate with us and with who we are. Certainly don't expect everybody to be some geek who reads strange books. But each of us is going to find that place. And I think that each congregation is going to have that same experience in whatever way makes sense for them. And probably somewhere in there, we come to a point where we just say, we just have to start. We just have to start. Uncle Claire? Go ahead, Uncle Claire.
I think he's frozen.
I felt that way sometimes too. Anyone else? Dar?
Yeah, I think sometimes, you know, the part you made about we're not to make the church successful. We need to uphold the faith that was there. And I think sometimes we try and force the discernment. And it's almost as if God just sits there and waits till you're done spinning your wheels and you say, I give up, and you sit on the dock and you look at the sunset and then it hits you. You know, when I worked at Honda, we used to tease our bosses. We would say, why do you call us analysts when you never give us time to think? And I think sometimes with church, trying to be transactional, trying to be successful, trying to be missional, show that we're missional, we get caught up in playing church, and we just never have the time to sit and to think of what it is. So you and I grew up in the same home with the same people, the same spiritual teachings and a family and so forth. You know, my experience on the farm is sitting in the tractor, plowing, hour after hour, up and down the field. You'd think it'd be the most boring thing in the world. To me, it was the most exciting time in my life because I learned to debate with myself. I learned to look at the alternatives. And it was an experience when I came to the point where I could say, my faith is not my dad's faith, not my grandfather's faith. Now I own it. Now, as life went on, you don't always live up to those standards or live up to the expectations you even have of yourself. And yet, we also can be lives that are restored and brought back into unity with Christ. And the last thing I'll say is, I love the story of Moses. You know, he wandered for 40 years. All of a sudden now I'm talking to people and seeing things. We'd say, you know what? We haven't seen each other for 40 years. Or this happened 40 years ago. Moses led those people into the land of the promised land. Many of the people that started out with him were dead, had died along the way. And so it was their children and grandchildren that came in. And when they went over the hill and saw the promised land, it wasn't the promised land that I'm sure that Moses originally preached. And yet he could see there and see the fruit of what was happening. Those people saw the promised land, not the promised land of the tradition of their parents and their grandparents, but now their future. So I think church is in a good spot. I think we are birthing a new sense of faith, spirituality, and maybe a new generation of people who will continue on the work of the church.
Thanks, Dar. Daryl?
I want to piggyback on what Susan was saying and also Bruce, but in reflecting to the slide that you showed earlier, Lew, it says awaken, risk, and bless. That particular slide, that when we're talking about discernment, and I am only talking personally right now, that unless I ask or put myself in a prayer mode, and that might be just talking thoughts to myself, unless I ask and listen and do or respond, so changing the words a little bit, awaken, risk, bless, I need to ask, I really need to listen, and I need to do. And that sort of discernment for myself can be either a short time, you know, like the mission prayer. What can I do, or what am I sensing I need to do today or tomorrow type of thing? But if I don't listen, I'm going to just keep busy and do nothing. But to truly be discerning what God wants me to do, it can be a short term or it can be long term. But the key for me is I can ask, and if I genuinely and in sincerity, if I listen and then I'm willing to listen, and then if I'm willing to do something, then I will sense that revolving circle, and it gets stronger and stronger, and I get more and more excited about it. But the challenge is to listen.
Okay. Uncle Claire, now that you're here.
I've lost power twice now, and we're having a storm here. Anyway, I was thinking that being an evangelist, this idea of discernment is present in every blessing. At least it should be. So we become awakened, like you said, to the Spirit, and then we have to discern in our minds what thoughts are coming to us that need to be presented to our candidate. And there is always that major risk that you're going to say something that either may not work out, or you may have misunderstood, or you may have misinterpreted the feeling and the discernment that we should have received from God. And so there is a great deal of things to learn about discernment, no matter how much experience you've got, and you've got to keep in tune in order and open-minded to receive that. So there's, in every blessing, there is some discernment required, and there is a great risk.
Do many congregations come together to discern missions on a yearly basis? And are there people that come and help congregations start that process? Traditionally, one of Bridget Street's mission is we have our $2 community dinner. Well, that's not going to happen. So I'm not sure where our mission in this next year will be. So that's what I'm trying to figure out, and how to come together with people to say, okay, how's Bridget Street now during this pandemic? How are we going to go forward?
I would encourage you, Susan, to get a hold of some of your 70 that are relatively close to your congregation, or one that you are have a good rapport with, because that's part of the 70 ministry also, to go into and brainstorm. Now, I'm talking times past, when I was in that particular role for 35 years. I know that was part of one of my responsibilities, and I'm assuming it's still part of that now. But talk to folks like that. And I'm so new in this new role that I have. I'm still working through the evangelist book to even discover some of these things, but I suspect it's very much a part of that also. Maybe people like Ruth and John and Claire can give you a better answer than that, but I'm sure it's part of that also.
The thing I am always concerned about when I talk about congregational, discernment and so on, is asking the question, are they just waiting for me? And so often, sometimes, maybe, possibly the answer is just, what do I think? What do you think? And you just go. And all of that is in that sense of having that faith. Someone mentioned that, is that you just kind of, somewhere in there, it moves from the certainty of this is what we're doing to the uncertainty and the risk of saying we're going to step out in faith. And it's a challenge. I hope that what you heard and the people that shared, we all have very, very different experiences of that process. And so personally, and I think as congregations, we're going to find that to be the case. Okay. I hope that the challenge of that we talked about is to thinking about how we're doing church. Are we risking enough? Are we being faithful enough? Those need to be the challenges that we ask ourselves. And so I'll look forward to next week to talking about all of that and some concrete things that we can do. I know that everybody wanted to get into that stuff right from day one, but I hope we've kind of set a little bit more of the context so that next week when we actually kind of say, hey, here's what our congregation's doing, here's what I'd like to do, here's some things that have happened to me, that now we'll have a context and some language to talk about them. Kathy?
I was thinking about expectations for success that perhaps, like I know myself, I need to step back from that, stop doing that, having expectations for success. I think that goes back to something that you said, actually. Okay, but because then I think that I have failed. But listen, there's things out there that I don't know about that I can do. But those expectations are killers.
Yeah. Yeah. If you weren't part of Beyond the Walls a couple of weeks ago and heard Danny Belrose's sermon, go online and listen to his sermon. That one, got at that whole thing of expectations. Well, we did the work. It's only fair that we get the rewards. And we did this or we did that or whatever. And at the end of it all, it has nothing to do with it. It's about that grace. And yet, at the same time, that doesn't mean that we just could do whatever or we just ignore. But we realize that it's that wonderful connection of our faithfulness that meets that grace. That is where good things happen, where blessings happen, where transformation happens. Otherwise, we run the risk of just analyzing something and making it another transaction. Right? Yeah. So thanks again, everybody. Appreciate it so much.